All right, this is our third and final section of amendment notes. These are amendments 19 through 27. And so you see the 19th Amendment there, passed in 1920. It granted women the right to vote. And so the amendment says the right to vote cannot be denied because of gender. The voting age then was for all adults 21 and over. And we will obviously revisit that because the voting age now is not 21. So we'll circle back around and have another voting rights amendment here in a few minutes. So that's the 19th Amendment, granted women the right to vote. The 20th Amendment is known as the lame duck amendment, and it changed when a newly elected president takes office. It used to be that the election was held in November, like it currently is, and that if a new president was elected, or even if the incumbent was re-elected, their new term would not start until March 20th. And the reason for that was just because of the amount of time it took to count votes back when the country was established, and then to get the transition president moved in. But the 20th Amendment, an easy way to remember this, 20th Amendment moved the presidential term of office from starting March 20th to January 20th instead. And Congress's new session began now January 3rd, and there's some caveats in there about when the weekend falls and that type of thing. And the reason for this is because in that period, from November to March, very little was accomplished by those outgoing officials. Even now, from November to January, when a new elected official takes over, not much is done, and so they wanted to obviously close that window, that gap of when not much was being done, because you knew somebody was heading out the door. The 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment and ended prohibition. So this is the only amendment to cancel out a previous amendment. The 21st Amendment canceled out the 18th Amendment. And so alcohol is again legal in the United States, and this ends the prohibition era. The 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, and it said that the president cannot serve more than 2 full terms or 10 years in office. This was passed in response to FDR, who during the Great Depression and then World War II was elected 4 different times. He actually died not too long into his 4th term. But what this says is the president can only be elected twice or serve 10 years. The scenario where they would potentially serve 10 years, because presidential terms are 4 years, is if they were a vice president and took over for the president. Depending on when they took over, it would depend on how many times that they could run. If they took over 2.5 years into a president's term, they could be in office for that last 1.5 years, run again, and so that would put them at 5.5 years, and then they would be allowed to run one more time, because that would max them out at 9.5 years. The 23rd Amendment gave citizens of Washington, D.C. The right to vote for president and vice president by awarding them 3 presidential electors. And that is what pushed our electoral vote count to 538, which we talked about when we talked about the Electoral College and elections. So the 23rd Amendment awarded 3 electoral votes to Washington, D.C. The 24th Amendment, another voting rights amendment, prohibited the use of poll taxes, which was a means to suppress the vote of the poor specifically, but I think more generically minority groups. So they were used to keep low-income minorities from voting, because they would basically charge them to cast their vote. So the 24th Amendment passed in 1964. And passed obviously in the middle of the civil rights era. The 25th Amendment passed in 1967, set up the presidential successions. So it said if the president dies, cannot lead, the vice president takes office. That had already been in place. But the second part of that says if the vice president dies or resigns, the president does not get to cannot appoint a replacement. Congress does, and so it's just the line of succession, and it goes I think 20 people deep of if this person dies, this person takes over and so on. And that was passed in 1967. The 26th Amendment, another voting rights amendment, lowered the voting age for all citizens from 21 to 18. Passed in 1971, which, if you know your US history, was in the midst of the Vietnam War. And so the justification here was that if you're old enough to go fight and potentially die in Vietnam for your country, that you should have the right to vote. And so those of you who are 18 and have already voted can thank the 26th Amendment for that opportunity. The last and final amendment that was passed in 1992, Amendment 27, states that congressional pay raises are effective during the term following their passage. So basically, Congress cannot approve their own raises. They wouldn't be able to take advantage of their raise until they were elected into office for their next term. And this was actually proposed back in 1789, so even before the Bill of Rights, but was not passed until 1992. That ends the notes over amendments 19 through 27. It also ends all of our notes over the amendments.